My name is Tiffany, and I am 31 years old. 5 years ago, my parents stood in the middle of my living room and told me I was the difficult daughter, the one who made everything about herself, the one who didn't understand the meaning of family unity. Then they walked out of my life to attend my younger sister, Chloe's birthday party, even though it was my wedding anniversary dinner. For 5 years, I have lived with the silence of a phone that never rings, and a family tree that has been pruned of my name. I built a clinical psychology practice in Boca Raton and found peace in a house where no one asked me to shrink so that my sister could take up more space. Then at 2:12 a.m. last Tuesday, the silence shattered. My phone vibrated against the nightstand with a frantic rhythm I recognized instantly. It was my mother. I didn't answer, but the voicemail she left was jagged with a panic that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with a mess only I could fix. She said Chloe was at the police precinct after a felony hit and run. She said my father was collapsing and that I was the only one with the connections to save them. They didn't call because they missed me. They called because the golden child finally broke the world and they needed the invisible daughter to pay for the repairs. Before we continue with how I handled that 2 a.m. call, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. We share these journeys because someone out there needs to know that setting a boundary is not a betrayal. I also want to know who is listening tonight. Drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let me take you back to a rainy night in Sarasota, and the exact moment I realized that in my parents' eyes I wasn't a daughter. I was an insurance policy they hoped they would never have to use. The rain was drumming against the roof of our childhood home, the kind of heavy Florida downpour that makes the rest of the world feel like it's drowning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my textbooks spread out, trying to finish a paper that would determine my scholarship standing. My father, David, was a retired naval officer who measured worth in degrees and discipline, yet he was currently laughing, as Chloe, then 22, described how she had accidentally spent her rent money on a weekend getaway to South Beach. My mother, Linda, just smiled and told her it was okay that we would find a way to cover it. When I asked if they could help me with a $50 application fee for an internship, my father didn't even look up from his coffee. He told me I was the reliable one and that I should figure it out myself because Chloe was going through a sensitive phase. That was the architecture of my youth. Chloe's whims were emergencies, and my emergencies were inconveniences. I was 26 years old, a doctoral candidate with a 4.0 GPA, and I was being told to wait in the hallway of my own life while my sister was handed the keys to everyone else's future. To understand why my finger hovers over the block button like a weapon I am too tired to use, you have to look at the dining table of my youth in Sarasota. It was a long, polished mahogany surface that anchored a house built on the shifting sands of perfection and performance. My parents, David and Linda, were the architects of that stage. David was a retired naval officer, a man who measured the world in crisp creases, military precision, and a rigid code of conduct that he applied to everyone except his younger daughter. Linda was a local charity board member, a woman whose smile was as curated as her rose garden, always ensuring the neighbors saw exactly what she wanted them to see. They valued two things above all else: the family's flawless reputation and Chloe's happiness. Everything else, including me, was just background noise. I was the reliable one. In our house, that was a death sentence for attention. I was the child who got the academic scholarships, so they never had to worry about tuition. I was the one who did the household taxes by age 16 and never made a sound when the floorboards creaked. I moved through that house like a ghost, making sure my existence never created a ripple that might disturb the carefully managed peace. Chloe, meanwhile, was the sensitive one. She was 3 years younger and seemed to require the entire family's emotional oxygen just to breathe. She needed the expensive private tutors, the constant second chances, and a level of indulgence that bordered on the religious. If Chloe was the sun, my parents were the planets locked in her orbit, and I was the cold, distant moon watching from the far edge of the solar system. There is a specific kind of pain in being forgotten, but it is nothing compared to the slow erasure of never being seen in the first place. I remember the state debate championship when I was 15. I had spent 6 months preparing, staying up until 3 in the morning to perfect my arguments while sitting on the cold tile of the bathroom floor so my desk lamp wouldn't wake anyone. It was the only time a student from our district had ever made it that far. On the morning of the finals, I walked into the kitchen wearing my only suit, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I found my parents huddled over Chloe. She was sobbing because she had developed fashion anxiety over a junior prom that was still 3 weeks away, an event she wasn't even eligible to attend yet. My father didn't look at my suit or my research binders. He just sighed and told me that they couldn't make the drive to the championship because Chloe was in a fragile state and needed her mother's guidance. My mother squeezed Chloe's hand and looked at me with that distant, polite smile she reserved for strangers. She told me I was so strong and independent that I didn't need them there to win. They stayed home to help a 14-year-old pick out shoes for a dance that didn't exist while I took a Greyhound bus to the state capitol alone. When I came home with the trophy, my father glanced at it and said it was nice before asking if I could help Chloe with her remedial math homework because she was too stressed to focus. The conflict in the Thatcher house was never a loud screaming match. It was a silent tactical withdrawal. It was the map of a home where every room was designed for Chloe's comfort and my compliance. I learned to read my parents' silence like a sailor reads the stars, navigating the gaps in their conversations, to find the places where I wasn't allowed to go. I realized early on that my achievements were expected, but Chloe's failures were events that required a full mobilization of family resources. If I succeeded, it was a Tuesday. If Chloe managed to wake up on time, it was a miracle that deserved a celebration. I grew up in the shadows of a Sarasota mansion, becoming a clinical psychologist specifically to understand why people choose to stay in rooms where they are invisible, never fully realizing that I was the primary case study for my own degree. But even a ghost eventually gets tired of haunting their own life. My parents viewed my competence as a reason to ignore me. They saw my stability as a license to neglect my needs. In modern American society, we often praise the resilient child, the one who raises themselves and never asks for help. We call them success stories. But inside that success is a hollow space where a family was supposed to be. While my father spent his retirement years managing Chloe's social life, and my mother spent hers defending Chloe's latest professional disaster, I was building a fortress of my own. I worked 3 jobs during my undergraduate years because they told me the college fund had been repurposed for Chloe's therapeutic horseback riding. I learned to survive on coffee and sheer spite, a combination that works wonders until you realize your heart is turning into a stone. I thought that by getting my doctorate, by becoming Dr. Tiffany Thatcher, I would finally earn a seat at the head of that mahogany table. I believed that once I had the title and the respect of my peers, my father would finally look at me with the same pride he felt when Chloe managed to go a whole week without losing her car keys. I was wrong. Success doesn't change a narcissist's vision, it only makes them resent you for highlighting the failures of their favorite. My parents didn't see my degree as a victory for the family. They saw it as an insult to Chloe, who was currently struggling through her 3rd attempt at a freshman year at a community college. My mother told me to downplay my graduation because she didn't want Chloe to feel inferior. My father told me he couldn't attend the ceremony because he was busy helping Chloe move into an apartment she couldn't afford with money he had taken from my dormant savings account. That was the architecture of my invisibility, a house where my presence was a burden and my absence was a relief. I became a master of the exit. I moved to Boca Raton, changed my social circle, and built a practice where I helped other people recognize the red flags I had ignored for decades. I met Mark, a man who saw me before I even spoke, a man who understood that being strong is often just a mask for being neglected. I thought I had closed the door on the Sarasota house forever. I thought the 5 years of no contact had finally allowed the wounds to scar over. But as the phone in my hand continues to vibrate with my mother's desperate calls, I realized that for people like David and Linda, a daughter is only invisible until they need her to be a shield. They haven't called to tell me they are proud of my practice. They haven't called to ask about my life. They are calling because the sun in their solar system has finally gone supernova, and they expect the distant moon to absorb the impact of the blast. Chloe is at the precinct, a felony hit and run, my father's Buick, the family name. The words in the voicemail are a checklist of everything they value more than me. As I sit on the edge of my bed in the quiet of my Boca Raton home, the emotional acting of my mother's voice grates against my ears. She is performing the role of the grieving matriarch, but I can hear the sharp edge of entitlement underneath. She isn't asking for my help, she is demanding my service. This is the new conflict, the one that bridges the gap between the girl who took the bus alone and the woman who now holds the power to let them drown in their own silence. They think the reliable daughter is still there waiting for permission to exist. They have no idea that the doctor they ignored has spent 5 years learning exactly how to say no. The first major fracture in our carefully managed family silence occurred in the spring of 2017. I was graduating with my doctorate in clinical psychology, a milestone that felt like a summit I had climbed entirely on my own. I had worked 3 jobs to pay for the credits my parents refused to fund, from late-night shifts at a crisis center to grading papers in the early morning light. My father had looked at my tuition bills 2 years earlier and declared them a bad investment of family resources. He claimed they needed to protect their capital for Chloe's entrepreneurial dreams, a term he used with a gravity usually reserved for military maneuvers. Those dreams eventually materialized as a luxury candle line that smelled like burnt sandalwood and lasted exactly 4 months before the inventory sat rotting in their garage. I didn't argue. I worked. I figured if I couldn't be the daughter they celebrated, I would be the daughter they couldn't possibly ignore. I sent the invitations 6 months in advance. I wanted to remove every excuse, every possible obstacle. I even paid for their hotel room at a high-end resort in Miami, using the meager savings I had managed to scrape together from my clinical internship. I wanted them to see me. I wanted to stand on that stage and watch my father's jaw set with the realization that I had done it without a single cent of his help. I wanted to see my mother's polished smile actually mean something. I had spent 27 years waiting for a seat at the table, and I believed that a doctoral hood would finally be the ticket that let me in. 2 hours before the ceremony began, I was standing in a bathroom stall at the university stadium, pinning my hair back with trembling hands. My phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was a text from my mother. "Chloe's dog is sick," the message read. "She is completely distraught and the vet says it might be an allergy. We can't possibly leave her alone in this state. You are so strong, Tiffany. You don't need us there to know you are a doctor. We will celebrate when you get home. Love, Mom." I stood in that stall for 5 minutes staring at the screen until the letters began to swim. "You are so strong." It was the same refrain they had used my entire life to justify their absence. Strength wasn't a compliment in the Thatcher house, it was a cage. It was the excuse they used to prioritize Chloe's smallest whim over my greatest achievement. Because I was strong, I didn't need a ride to the science fair. Because I was strong, I could handle my own broken arm at 16 while they took Chloe to the mall. Because I was strong, I could graduate with a doctorate alone in a city where I had no one. I realized then that strength was just the name my parents gave to their own neglect. I walked out of that bathroom and into the heat of the Miami afternoon. I took my place in the 3rd row of the graduating class, surrounded by hundreds of students whose parents were currently screaming from the bleachers. I looked at the 2 empty seats in the section I had reserved, the 2 spaces I had paid for with my own blood and sweat. They were like missing teeth in a smile. I watched other families erupt in cheers, seen fathers lifting their daughters into the air, heard mothers weeping with a pride that sounded like music. I sat in a silence so heavy I could feel it in my lungs. I didn't cry. Not a single tear. I had learned a long time ago that crying in the Thatcher house only made you a target for Chloe's competitive suffering. When the dean finally called my name, I stood up and walked across that stage with a spine made of cold steel. I shook the hands of professors who knew more about my research than my father knew about my life. I accepted my diploma and felt the weight of the paper in my hand. It was the first thing I truly owned that didn't have their fingerprints on it. As the flash of the university photographer's camera blinded me for a second, I didn't see my parents in the crowd. I saw the exit. That was the day the invisible daughter began to plan her escape. I realized that if I was strong enough to survive their neglect, I was strong enough to live without their approval. I drove back to my small apartment that evening, the doctoral hood still draped over my passenger seat. I didn't go home to Sarasota to celebrate. I knew exactly what that celebration would look like: Chloe holding court about her dog's recovery, while my mother served cake, and my father asked me if I could help him move some boxes in the attic, since I was so capable. Instead, I sat at my laptop and opened a secret savings account. I labeled it architecture. It was the first brick in a wall. I was building a wall they would never be able to climb. I began to funnel every spare dollar into that account, every refund check, every bit of side hustle money. I was building my own security because I knew now that the people who raised me would never provide it. My background in psychology told me that this was a classic case of family role casting. I was the overachiever, the one who sought validation through perfection. Chloe was the identified patient, the one who stayed small so the parents could feel powerful by saving her. My parents were the enablers, addicted to the drama of Chloe's fragility. Because it gave their lives a purpose, my independence denied them. I understood the mechanics of it, but understanding the gears doesn't make the machine hurt any less when it grinds you down. I spent the next year working as a postdoctoral fellow, perfecting my clinical skills, and growing my secret account. I was a ghost in their world, attending the Sunday dinners. I couldn't avoid nodding when they talked about Chloe's new venture into organic soaps, and never once mentioning my own life. The new conflict started to simmer beneath the surface. My parents began to sense the shift, though they couldn't name it. My father would make comments about how distant I seemed, how I wasn't as helpful as I used to be. My mother would sigh and mention that Chloe was feeling hurt that I didn't ask her more about her soap business. They wanted the old Tiffany back, the one who absorbed their stress and asked for nothing. But that version of me had died in the third row of a graduation ceremony in Miami. I was no longer a daughter. I was a strategist. I was waiting for the right moment to walk through the door I was building. The tension reached a breaking point during a random Tuesday dinner in late 2017. Chloe was complaining that her car needed new tires and that she couldn't afford them because the organic soap market was unexpectedly competitive. My father looked at me, his eyes expectant. He didn't ask me how my practice was going. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply said, "Tiffany, you're doing so well at that clinic. You should cover the tires for your sister. It's the least you can do for the family." I set my fork down with a quiet click against the china. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the entitlement etched into the lines of his face. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was taxing my existence. I realized that as long as I was in their reach, I would always be an ATM for Chloe's failures. I looked at my mother, who was nodding encouragingly, waiting for me to be strong again. I felt the secret savings account in my pocket like a hidden weapon. I told them I would think about it, knowing full well that I was actually thinking about how far 200 miles would feel once I finally left. The fracture was no longer a crack. It was a canyon, and I was about to jump. But before I could even pack my bags, Chloe managed to create a new disaster that would prove exactly how much my parents were willing to sacrifice to keep me in my place. By 2019, I had stopped looking for validation in the eyes of my parents and started finding it in the faces of my clients. I was a rising star in the Florida psychological community, known for my work with complex family systems and the quiet, durable scars of childhood neglect. Ironic, I know. I was fixing other people's foundations while mine was still made of wet Florida sand. My husband Mark was the one person who didn't view my competence as an excuse to ignore me. He saw the work I put in, the long hours I spent at the clinic, and the way I meticulously organized our life so that no one ever felt like an inconvenience. He understood that my need for order was a survival mechanism from a house where the only way to be safe was to be invisible. For our first wedding anniversary, we planned something significant. It wasn't just a celebration of our marriage. It was a stake in the ground for my new life. We chose a historic hotel in St. Augustine, a place where the air felt thick with permanence, and the stone walls suggested that some things are built to last. My parents, David and Linda, had promised to attend. They had offered this dinner as a peace offering, a way to make up for the graduation ceremony they had skipped 2 years prior. My mother had been particularly effusive on the phone, telling me how proud she was of the woman I had become, and how much she looked forward to celebrating our milestone. I wanted to believe her. Despite everything I knew about narcissism and the roles we played, a small, stubborn part of me still hoped that this would be the moment the hierarchy shifted. At 6 p.m. on that Friday evening, I stood before the ornate mirror in our hotel suite, adjusting the straps of a silk dress that felt like a second skin. I looked like a woman who had everything under control. I was 30 years old, successful, loved, and about to sit at a table where I was the guest of honor. Mark was behind me, fixing his tie, catching my eye in the reflection, with a smile that made me feel grounded. We were ready. The reservations were set, the wine was breathing, and for once the Thatcher family drama felt like a distant shore. But 200 miles away in Sarasota, the sun was beginning to set, and Chloe was beginning to spin. She didn't call me. She never called me when she wanted to ignite a crisis. She knew I would ask for documentation, for logic, for a police report. Instead, she called our parents. She claimed she had been scammed out of $2,000 in a bad lease agreement for her latest studio space. She spun a frantic tale of being threatened by a mysterious landlord, of locks being changed, of her safety being at risk. It was a classic Chloe production, timed perfectly to coincide with the exact moment my parents would have been getting into their car to drive to St. Augustine. David and Linda didn't call me to explain. They didn't send a text to say they were running late. They simply didn't show up. Mark and I sat in the hotel's grand dining room, a space filled with the soft clink of silver and the low murmur of happy couples. We waited. 15 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. I watched the entrance of the restaurant. Every time the heavy oak doors swung open, my heart sinking lower with every stranger who walked through. The server began to circle our table with increasing frequency, his eyes filled with a pity that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. He had seen this before, the woman in the expensive dress waiting for people who weren't coming. At 7:30 p.m., I finally broke. I called my father. He answered on the third ring, his voice breathless and high-pitched with the adrenaline of a rescue mission. I didn't even get a hello. Tiffany. We're in the car heading to Chloe, he said. He sounded like he was in the middle of a tactical extraction. She's terrified. Some man is threatening her over a lease. We couldn't just sit there and eat dinner while your sister was in danger. But Dad? I said, my voice sounding small and foreign to my own ears. It's my anniversary. You promised. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of the highway humming in the background. Your anniversary happens every year, Tiffany, he said, and I could hear the familiar edge of irritation in his tone. But Chloe only has one sister who actually cares about her. You're so successful, you have Mark, you have your life. Chloe has nothing right now. We have to be there. We'll make it up to you. He hung up. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't apologize for the $300 deposit I was about to lose. He simply chose the daughter who made the most noise over the one who made the most sense. Again. It was the lie they had told for 20 years, that Chloe had two sisters, but only one who was expected to be a perpetual sacrifice for the other's instability. I was the reliable daughter, which meant I was the one who could be hurt without consequence. I was the one whose milestones could be traded for Chloe's manufactured emergencies. I looked across the table at Mark. He didn't say I told you so. He just reached out and took my hand. His silence was the opposite of my father's. It was a shield. I realized in that moment that I was done being the backup plan. I was done waiting for a seat at a table that was always being moved. I stood up, the silk of my dress rustling like a warning. I walked out of that historic dining room and into the warm, humid air of the St. Augustine night. A homeless veteran was sitting on a bench near the hotel entrance, his eyes tired but kind. I walked over to him, handed him the receipt for the $300 steak dinner we hadn't eaten, and told him to go inside and tell them Dr. Thatcher sent him. He looked at me with a confusion that quickly turned into a toothless grin. I didn't wait for his thanks. I turned off my phone, the device that connected me to their chaos, and walked toward the water with Mark. The betrayal of the anniversary wasn't just about a missed dinner. It was the moment the architecture of my invisibility became undeniable. I saw the hierarchy of my family for what it was. David at the top, Chloe as the protected center, and Linda as the enabler, who kept the gears greased with my blood. I was the exterior wall meant to hold everything together and take the brunt of the storm, never expected to have a life of my own inside. As we walked along the bayfront, the salt air stinging my skin, I felt a strange cold clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger implies you still expect something to change. I felt finished. When I finally turned my phone back on the next morning, there were no apologies. There was only a text from my mother asking if I could Venmo Chloe $500 because David had spent all their cash on the locksmith and the landlord. I didn't reply. I didn't even delete it. I simply blocked their numbers. I spent the rest of our anniversary weekend in a silence that felt like a sanctuary. I realized that for 5 years, I had been trying to build a bridge to people who were busy burning the forest on the other side. I returned to Boca Raton on Monday and began the process of total severance. I didn't send a letter. I didn't make a grand announcement. I simply stopped existing in their world. I moved my practice to a more secure building, updated my emergency contacts to remove their names, and told my staff that I was no longer accepting calls from Sarasota. I thought that by cutting the cord I had won. I thought the 5 years of silence that followed were the victory. I lived my life, grew my practice, and became a woman who is no longer a backup daughter. But as I stand here now, years later, watching the blue and red lights of the police cruisers pulse against the glass of the precinct, I realize that silence is a temporary fix for a permanent problem. My parents and Chloe had been busy in that silence, and what they had built in my absence was far more dangerous than a failed candle line or fashion anxiety. The 2 a.m. call wasn't an olive branch, it was a summons. They had found a way to bridge the gap I had created, and it involved a crime that would force me to look at the ruins of our family one last time. Chloe was in a cell, David was collapsing, and a man I once respected was fighting for his life in a hospital bed because of them. The anniversary dinner was the last time I let them break my heart, but the precinct was where I would have to decide if I was willing to let them break my life. I moved my practice 200 miles south to Boca Raton and changed my phone number before the St. Augustine sun had even fully set on that disastrous anniversary weekend. I didn't send a forwarding address. I didn't post a cryptic status update on social media. I simply vanished from the Thatcher family frequency. For 5 years, I was a ghost, a name they might whisper in the dark, but could no longer reach with their demands. I built a life where my worth was no longer measured by how much psychological stress I could absorb for Chloe, or how many financial fires I could extinguish for my parents. I traded the humid, heavy air of Sarasota for a house with a porch facing the Gulf, where the only thing I had to nurture was a garden that didn't scream when it was thirsty. In those 5 years of silence, the architecture of the Sarasota house began to crumble. Without me there to act as the buffer, the family dynamic started to rot from the inside out. I had spent decades being the lightning rod, catching every bolt of Chloe's instability and grounding it so my parents didn't have to feel the burn. Now that the rod was gone, the house was taking direct hits. David and Linda, now drifting into their late 60s, transitioned from part-time defenders to full-time enablers. They didn't have the energy to hold Chloe accountable, so they chose the easier path. They fed the beast. I heard bits of the wreckage through an old childhood friend named Sarah, who still lived 3 blocks away from my parents. Sarah was my window into a world I had intentionally left behind. She told me that Chloe had moved back into the guest suite permanently after her organic soap business, and 3 other startups collapsed under the weight of her lack of follow-through. Chloe was now calling herself an influencer, spending her days filming meticulously edited videos about her journey to wellness, while my father took a part-time job as a nighttime security guard at a local marina just to keep up with the rising property taxes. It was a staggering role reversal. The retired naval officer, who once measured success by discipline, was now wearing a polyester uniform and patrolling docks at 3 in the morning to fund his younger daughter's ring light and camera lenses. The retirement savings that were supposed to be my parents' safety net had been liquidated to cover Chloe's escalating legal fees from a series of minor traffic violations and her expensive wellness retreats in Sedona. Linda had started doing remote bookkeeping for a dry cleaner, her fingers stiff with arthritis as she tried to balance books that would never be as heavy as the debts Chloe was incurring. They were drowning in a sea of their own making, and the irony was that they were still telling the neighbors that Chloe was on the verge of a major breakthrough. In the Thatcher house, the lie was the only thing more important than the truth. I listened to Sarah's updates over the phone while sitting in my office in Boca Raton, looking out at the palm trees swaying in the gentle breeze. I felt the old familiar pang of the reliable child guilt, a sharp needle in my chest that told me I should go back. It told me I should fix the taxes, find Chloe a real job, and let my father sleep through the night. But then I would look at my appointment book full of clients who were finally learning to stand on their own feet, because I taught them how, and I would remember the empty seats at my graduation. I would remember the cold steak on the table in St. Augustine. I looked at the peace I had cultivated with my own 2 hands and chose myself again. Success in modern American society is often a lonely mountain. My practice was thriving. I had specialized in high-conflict family resolution, ironically becoming the person who helps people survive exactly what I had fled. I was earning more in a month than my father was making in a year at the marina. I had built a reputation for being decisive, clinical, and unshakable. But every Thanksgiving, when Mark and I would host a small, boisterous group of our chosen family, I would catch a glimpse of my reflection in the window and wonder if my parents even knew I was still in Florida. I wondered if they had ever looked at the trophies I left in the garage and felt even a flicker of regret. The conflict of my absence wasn't just about the silence, it was about the vacuum I left behind. When the scapegoat leaves the herd, the predators have to find someone else to target. My parents began to turn on each other. Sarah told me she could hear them arguing through the hedges, my father's booming military voice clashing with my mother's sharp, defensive retorts. They were finally forced to live with the person they had spent 30 years creating. Chloe wasn't a sensitive soul anymore. She was a 30-year-old woman with a teenager's sense of entitlement and a complete lack of empathy for the people who were sacrificing their golden years to keep her afloat. There was a profound psychological justice in seeing the enablers become the victims of their own creation. My father, the man who once mocked me for needing a $50 internship fee, was now begging the marina manager for extra shifts so Chloe could buy a new smartphone. My mother, who told me I was so strong I didn't need a mother's presence at my graduation, was now spending her weekends crying in the laundry room because Chloe had spoken to her with a cruelty that even Linda couldn't sugarcoat for the neighbors. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, and the bars were forged from the lies they had told about me for decades. I kept the block on my phone active, but the digital world is a porous thing. Every few months, an unknown number would call, or a new social media profile would try to follow my professional page. I knew it was them. I knew the cadence of the desperation. I could almost hear the words they wanted to say. Come back and fix this. Come back and be the wall again. But I had learned that you cannot save people who are addicted to the very thing that is killing them. My parents loved being Chloe's saviors more than they loved their own peace. They needed her to be broken so they could feel essential. I was simply the one who realized that being essential to a narcissist is just another word for being a slave. As the 5-year mark approached, the updates from Sarah became darker. Chloe had started hanging out with a crowd that didn't care about wellness or influence. There were whispers of late-night parties at the Sarasota house while my father was at work. There were mentions of strange cars in the driveway and local police officers being called for noise complaints. The flawless Thatcher reputation was no longer a polished shield. It was a cracked mirror. David and Linda were no longer pillars of the community. They were the people everyone pitied, but no one wanted to invite to dinner. They had traded their reliable daughter for a legacy of chaos, and the bill was finally coming due. I thought I had reached the end of the story. I thought the 5-year silence was the final chapter. I was a doctor, a wife, and a woman who had finally learned to breathe without permission. But as the clock on my nightstand ticked toward 2:12 a.m. last Tuesday, I didn't know that the rot in the Sarasota house had reached the foundation. I didn't know that Chloe's latest emergency wasn't something a locksmith or a small Venmo payment could fix. The phone vibrated, the light cutting through the dark like a warning flare. The silence was over, and the new conflict was about to drag me back into a storm that would prove once and for all that blood doesn't make you family, it only gives people the coordinates to find you when the world starts to burn. I picked up the phone, and as my mother's voice shattered my 5 years of peace, I realized that the hardest part of walking away isn't the leaving. It's the moment they try to convince you that you never actually left. The phone on my nightstand didn't just vibrate. It screamed. It was a rhythmic, unrelenting pulse that cut through the silence of my Boca Raton bedroom like a physical blow. I watched the screen glow with my mother's name for the 4th time in 10 minutes. My husband Mark shifted beside me, his eyes half open, reflecting the blue light of the device. He didn't ask who it was. He knew. In 5 years, that phone had only made that specific sound when a disaster was looming. I finally reached out, my fingers cold, and swiped to accept the call. I didn't say hello. I waited. "Tiffany, please." It wasn't my mother's voice. It was my father, David. The man who once commanded a naval vessel with a voice of iron now sounded like wet paper tearing in the wind. There was a hollow, echoing quality to his tone that told me he was standing in a large tiled room, a hospital, or a police station. "Tiffany, Chloe has been arrested. It is a felony hit and run. She was driving my Buick. The other person, the victim, they are in critical condition." I sat up, the silk of my sheets rustling, a sharp contrast to the grit I could hear in my father's breathing. The professional psychologist in me didn't just wake up, she took the wheel. My heart didn't race. Instead, my mind began to categorize the information into clinical bins. Mechanism of injury, legal repercussions, financial liability. I grabbed a notepad from the drawer. "Give me the case number," I said, my voice as flat and cool as the marble floor downstairs. "Give me the precinct address and the name of the arresting officer." "Why are you calling me Dad?" I asked, the words sharp and surgical. "You have spent 5 years telling me that Chloe's high-powered influencer friends are the new elite. You told me her circle was full of movers and shakers who understood the modern world better than a boring doctor like me. Call them. They are the ones who usually handle her emergencies." "They aren't answering, Tiffany," he whispered. The sound of his pride breaking was almost audible over the line. I heard a muffled sob in the background, my mother Linda likely performing her grief for the benefit of any officer walking by. "The lawyer at the desk says because it is my car and the insurance had lapsed, they might come for the house. Chloe was supposed to pay the bill with the money I gave her last month, but she forgot. She said she was stressed." "Tiffany, you are a doctor. You have the savings. You have the connections. You have to save us." The conflict didn't just deepen, it calcified. They weren't calling because the 5-year silence had taught them the value of their eldest daughter. They weren't calling to apologize for the missed graduation or the ruined anniversary dinner. They were calling because the golden child had finally driven the family legacy into a brick wall, and they needed the invisible daughter to act as the structural repair. I was the reliable one again. I was the insurance policy they had kept in a drawer waiting for the day the primary plan went up in flames. I stood up and began to dress in the dark, my movements methodical. Mark watched me, his face a mask of quiet concern. He didn't tell me not to go. He knew that I needed to see the ruins for myself to finally believe the house was empty. As I pulled on a blazer, I realized the staggering irony of the situation. My father, the man who once mocked my $50 internship fee as a burden, was now asking me to liquidate my life to protect his. He was terrified of losing the Sarasota house, the white colonial with the trimmed lawn that had served as the stage for 30 years of lies. He didn't mention the victim's life, he didn't ask how I was, he only talked about the assets. "You understand what you are asking," I said into the phone, pinning the device between my shoulder and ear as I grabbed my keys. "You are asking me to use the money I earned while you weren't looking to fix a disaster caused by the person you chose over me. You are asking the doctor to save the person who tried to erase her. It is your sister Tiffany." He snapped, a flicker of the old naval commander returning to his voice. "Family comes first. You have always been the difficult one, the one who holds grudges. Put that aside for once and be the woman we raised you to be." "The woman you raised is exactly who is speaking to you, Dad," I replied. I hung up before he could answer. I walked down the stairs of my quiet, peaceful home and out into the humid Florida night. The drive to the precinct would take nearly 3 hours, 3 hours of darkness, to think about the fact that my parents were willing to let me be a ghost for half a decade, but the moment their own comfort was threatened, they expected me to materialize as a savior. As I hit the highway, the blue lights of the dashboard reflecting in my eyes, I thought about the victim. Critical condition. A felony charge in Florida meant prison time. It meant the end of the influencer dream and the beginning of a reality Chloe couldn't edit with a filter. But my parents weren't worried about justice. They were worried about the property taxes and the neighbors' opinions. They were worried about the fact that the golden child had finally proven she was made of lead. The layer of conflict shifted as I realized the deeper trap. If the insurance had truly lapsed on a car involved in a felony hit and run, the civil liability alone would be enough to strip my parents of everything they owned. They weren't just asking for bail. They were asking me to become the primary financial tether for a sinking ship. They wanted me to sign my name to their survival. I arrived at the precinct as the sun was beginning to bleed a bruised purple over the horizon. The building was a squat concrete fortress, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. I saw them through the glass of the waiting area. David looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched under a frayed polo shirt. Linda was clutching a designer handbag that Chloe had probably bought with their grocery money. They looked like people who had run out of lies. When they saw me walk through the heavy steel doors, Linda stood up, her arms reaching out as if the last 5 years had been a weekend trip. "Tiffany, thank God," she cried, her voice echoing off the sterile tiles. "You're here. You can fix this. You always fix this." I didn't let her touch me. I didn't sit down. I looked at my father, who wouldn't meet my eyes. "I am here to see the case file," I said. "I am here to see the victim's status. I am not here to fix anything yet." A detective emerged from the back, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum. "Dr. Thatcher," he said, recognizing my name from the trauma workshops I had conducted for the department. "We need to talk about your sister, but more importantly, we need to talk about the man she hit." I followed him into a small, cramped office, leaving my parents standing in the hallway like discarded furniture. The detective opened a folder and slid a photo across the desk. My breath hitched in my throat. The world didn't just tilt. It inverted. The man in the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors, was someone I knew. He was someone who had been the only person to see me when I was a ghost in my own home. And as the detective began to speak, I realized that the conflict was no longer about family loyalty or financial survival. It was about a debt of honor to the only man who had ever treated me like a daughter and the sister who had just tried to kill him. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before walking toward the station entrance, the heavy humidity of the Florida night pressing against the windshield like a physical weight. My father's frantic words about a lapsed insurance policy and a collapsing house didn't sit right in my mind. In my years of clinical practice, I had learned that when narcissists start talking about their own destruction, they are usually hiding the matches they used to start the fire. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Marcus was a forensic accountant I had retained during a particularly ugly high-conflict divorce case back in Boca. He was a man who found the truth in the spaces between decimal points, and right now I needed someone who spoke the language of cold, hard facts. Marcus. It's Tiffany Thatcher, I said when he picked up on the second ring, his voice sounding scratchy with sleep. I need a rush on a property title search and any recent lien filings for David and Linda Thatcher in Sarasota. I also need you to pull any recent credit applications under my name. I have a feeling the floor is about to drop out. He didn't ask questions. He just told me he would have a preliminary report in an hour. I leaned my head back against the leather headrest, watching the strobe of the blue and red lights from the squad cars reflect in the puddles of the parking lot. While I waited, the professional investigator in my brain started connecting the dots my father had accidentally left exposed. David Thatcher was a man of military precision. He didn't just forget to pay an insurance bill on the very vehicle he allowed his high-risk daughter to drive. Men like him have autopay for their autopay. If the insurance had lapsed, it wasn't an oversight. It was a choice made because the money was gone. Chloe didn't just forget. She had likely drained the account, and my parents had allowed it, because saying no to her felt like a betrayal of the golden child narrative they had spent 3 decades perfecting. They were drowning, and they had called me to be the life raft for a ship they had intentionally scuttled. The chime of a text message broke the silence. Marcus had sent a screenshot of the Sarasota County property records. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. My father's house, the colonial with the manicured lawn and the white fence, was currently under a second mortgage taken out only 6 months ago. But that wasn't the kicker. The kicker was a series of small business loan applications that had been flagged for further review. Applications filed in my name, using my professional credentials as a clinical psychologist without my knowledge. They hadn't just ignored me for 5 years. They had been harvesting my identity to fund Chloe's influencer studio and her latest string of failed ventures. Chloe didn't just break the law tonight. My entire family had been breaking it for years. I stepped out of the car, the air smelling of ozone and wet pavement. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the precinct, my heels clicking on the linoleum with a sound that felt like a countdown. My mother Linda saw me immediately. She rose from the hard plastic bench, her face a carefully constructed mask of performative grief. She had always been a master of the optics of suffering, knowing exactly how to tilt her head to make her eyes look larger and more vulnerable. She rushed toward me, her arms outstretched, a sob already forming in her throat. I didn't move. I didn't reach out. I simply stepped back, putting 3 feet of cold air between us. The hug died in the space between us. "No drama, Mom," I said, my voice sounding like a gavel striking wood. "That's what you told me 5 years ago when you canceled my wedding anniversary dinner. Remember, you said Victoria doesn't want drama. You told me I was the difficult one for being hurt. So let's keep this professional. I am here as a doctor, not as a daughter. This is different." "Tiffany," she cried, her voice rising to a pitch that made a nearby desk sergeant look up from his paperwork. "This is life and death. Chloe is in a cell. Your father is at his breaking point. We are talking about our home. You can't hold a grudge from 5 years ago when your sister might go to prison." "No," I replied, shifting my gaze to the heavy steel door that led to the holding cells. I could hear Chloe's voice through the wall, sharp and entitled, arguing with a guard about why she wasn't allowed to have her phone to update her followers. "This isn't a life-or-death crisis, Mom. This is the natural consequence of 27 years of you telling Chloe that her actions don't have footprints. You spent your life smoothing the sand behind her so she never had to see the mess she made. Well, she finally stepped in something you can't sweep away." My father emerged from a side hallway flanked by a public defender who looked like he hadn't slept since the mid-90s. David looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the old commander in his eyes, the man who expected me to fall into line. But then his gaze dropped to the floor. He couldn't look at me because he knew I had seen the property records. He knew that the reliable child was finally holding the bill for the golden child's life. Tiffany the lawyer says, if we can post the $25,000 cash bond tonight, we can get her out before the morning arraignment. David said, his voice a low rumble. We don't have it. Every cent is tied up in the business. But you have the practice. You have the credit. I looked at him, my heart feeling like it had turned into a smooth, cold stone. You mean the credit you already tried to use? I asked. I saw the loan applications, Dad. I saw the second mortgage. You didn't just ignore me for 5 years. You treated my identity like a line of credit for Chloe's studio. You used my doctorate, my hard-earned reputation, to secure funding for a woman who can't even pay an insurance bill. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of feigned shock that didn't reach her eyes. We were going to pay it back, Tiffany. We were just in a tight spot. We knew you'd want to help your sister if you only knew how much she was struggling. We were protecting you from the stress. Protecting me. I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut through the hum of the precinct. You were protecting your own comfort. You were protecting the lie that Chloe is a success. And now you want me to pay $25,000 to let her walk out of here so she can keep pretending, while a man I care about is lying in a hospital bed because she couldn't be bothered to stop. David stepped forward, his face reddening. That's enough. We are your parents. We made sacrifices for you for 18 years. We gave you a roof, a name, and a foundation. You owe us this. You owe the family this. I looked at the public defender, who was carefully looking at his shoes, and then back at the man who raised me. The foundation you gave me was built on my own silence, I said. And the roof you're so worried about losing, it's held up by the money you stole from my future. I am not signing anything tonight. I am not paying a single cent for a bail bond. I am going to see the victim. And then I am going to talk to the district attorney about why my social security number is on a loan for an influencer studio in Sarasota. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. My mother's face finally dropped the mask of grief, revealing a sharp, ugly desperation. My father's shoulders slumped, the military posture finally failing him. They realized then that the invisible daughter wasn't just seen, she was the one holding the lights. But as I turned to walk toward the hospital wing, my father said something that suggested the hit and run wasn't the only crime Chloe had committed tonight. He mentioned a name, a partner in Chloe's business, that made the forensic accountant's report look like child's play. The conflict wasn't just a family betrayal anymore. It was a looming disaster that could pull my own professional license into the fire if I didn't find out exactly what Chloe had signed in my name. The detective leads me through a heavy set of double doors into the secured hospital wing attached to the precinct. The air here is different than the lobby. It is colder and smells of sharp antiseptic and industrial laundry. He stops in front of a glass partition labeled Bay 4. Dr. Thatcher, he says quietly, your sister is in deep. The blood alcohol level and the fleeing of the scene are one thing, but there is something you need to know about the person in the other vehicle. I look through the glass and the world seems to stop spinning. The man lying on the bed is tangled in a web of plastic tubing and rhythmic monitors. His face is swollen and his arm is set in a heavy cast, but I would recognize those kind, intelligent eyes anywhere. It is Mr. Harrison. I feel my knees weaken as I lean against the cold metal frame of the door. Mr. Harrison was 70 years old and a retired history teacher, but to me he was the person who handed me a lifeline when I was drowning in my own house. In the 10th grade, when my parents told me that helping with my college applications was too much paperwork and that I should just focus on helping Chloe finish her middle school projects, Mr. Harrison was the one who stayed after school for 2 hours every Tuesday. He sat with me in a dusty classroom and helped me draft my personal statement. He wrote a recommendation letter that described me not as the reliable child, but as a brilliant mind with untapped potential. He saw the woman I could become when my father only saw a convenient ghost. Now that man is broken because my sister couldn't be bothered to tap her brakes. The irony is a physical weight in my chest. Chloe, the daughter, my parents prioritized every single second, had nearly extinguished the only person who had ever prioritized me. The conflict was no longer about family loyalty or financial survival. It was a moral war. I am looking at the man who saved my future, now shattered by the sister they chose every single time. My father's voice echoes in my head from the hallway demanding a fixer, demanding a way to protect the family name. He wants me to find a high-priced attorney who specializes in making felony charges vanish into thin air. He wants me to use my professional connections to pressure the hospital staff or find a loophole in the police report. But as I stand at the edge of Mr. Harrison's bed watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, I realize that protecting the Thatcher name would be a betrayal of everything this man taught me about integrity. The detective watches me, his eyes searching my face. "You know him," he observes. It wasn't a question. I nod slowly, my throat feeling like it's full of glass. "He was my teacher," I whisper. "He is the reason I am a doctor." The detective sighs and looks at the chart. He has a collapsed lung and internal bleeding. If he doesn't stabilize by morning, the charges against your sister move from felony hit and run to vehicular manslaughter. I step closer to the bed and gently take Mr. Harrison's hand. His skin feels like thin parchment. I think about the Sarasota house and the white colonial fence. I think about my mother's performative tears and my father's military pride. They are in the cafeteria right now, probably calculating the cost of a private investigator. They haven't asked about the victim once. To them, Mr. Harrison isn't a human being with a life and a history. He is an obstacle to Chloe's freedom. He is an inconvenience to their curated reputation. My background as a psychologist tells me that this is the ultimate test of the scapegoat's resolve. The family system is trying to pull me back into my role. They want me to be the one who cleans up the mess. They want me to absorb the guilt and the cost, so they can go back to pretending Chloe is a victim of circumstance. But looking at Mr. Harrison, I realize that if I save Chloe, I am complicit in his erasure. I am telling the world that my sister's comfort is worth more than this man's life. I can hear the soft beep of the heart monitor, a steady reminder of the stakes. Every time that machine sounds, it feels like a countdown to a decision I can't take back. If I hire the attorney my father wants, I am effectively working against the man who gave me a future. I am using the very success Mr. Harrison helped me build to protect the person who tried to kill him. The sickness of that realization makes me want to scream. My father walks into the hospital wing, ignored by the guard, because he looks like a man on a mission. He stops behind me, not even looking at the man in the bed. "Tiffany. I just spoke to a guy who knows a firm in Tampa," he says, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "They can get the breathalyzer results suppressed if we move fast. But they want a $50,000 retainer. I told them you'd call within the hour." I don't turn around. I keep my eyes on Mr. Harrison's bruised face. "Dad, do you know who this is?" I ask. My voice is steady, but there is an edge to it that should have warned him. He glances at the bed with a flicker of annoyance. "Some old man," he says. "It's tragic, Tiffany, truly. But we have to think about Chloe. She's young. She has her whole life ahead of her. This man has lived his. You can't let one accident ruin your sister's future." I turn to face him then, and the look in my eyes makes him take a step back. "This man is Mr. Harrison," I say. "He is the teacher who did the paperwork you were too busy to touch. He is the reason I got into college while you were busy buying Chloe a third car. He is the only reason I am a doctor with the money you are currently trying to spend." My father's jaw tightens. "That's irrelevant now," he snaps. "This is about family. Are you going to help us, or are you going to stand there and be the difficult daughter while your sister rots in a cell?" The conflict is no longer a silent tactical withdrawal, it is an open battlefield. My father is standing in a hospital wing, asking me to treat a human life like a line item on a budget. He is asking me to betray my mentor to save his favorite. I realized then that my parents don't just neglect me, they find my values offensive. My success is a tool to be used, and my gratitude is a weakness to be exploited. I look past him at my mother, who is standing by the door, her eyes darting around to see if anyone is watching this unseemly display. She doesn't see a dying man, she sees a potential lawsuit. She sees the end of her social standing in Sarasota. She sees a problem that her reliable daughter should have already solved. I'm not calling the firm in Tampa, I say. I am going to wait here until Mr. Harrison wakes up, and then I am going to tell the police exactly how many times Chloe has driven your Buick while impaired over the last 6 months. My mother let out a sharp, choked sound. You wouldn't, she whispered. You would send your own sister to prison. I would send a criminal to justice, I replied. And if that includes the people who gave her the keys, then so be it. The drama doesn't just increase, it shifts into a new gear of legal and professional danger. As I say the words, I see the public defender walking toward us with a look of sheer panic on his face. He has a document in his hand, a copy of the intake form Chloe signed when she was processed. He catches my eye and then looks at my father. Mr. Thatcher, we have a massive problem, he says. I realize then that the hit and run wasn't just a physical collision. It was the moment Chloe decided to use my name as her shield one last time. As the lawyer opens the file, I see my own professional license number listed as the primary insurance guarantor. Chloe didn't just drive the car, she had forged my signature on a new policy 3 weeks ago to cover the lapse. My own sister had turned me into her unwitting accomplice before she even hit the gas. The moral war just became a fight for my own survival. The sterile white light of the precinct cafeteria felt like it was vibrating against my retinas as the clock on the wall ticked toward 5 a.m. The air was thick with the smell of burnt decaf and the heavy metallic scent of floor wax. My father David sat across from me at a bolted-down plastic table, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look like a stranger. He wasn't the commander anymore. He was a man drowning in the consequences of his own enabling. He leaned forward, his hands trembling so violently that the cheap styrofoam cup of coffee between us rattled. He laid out the numbers with a desperate practiced speed. He said he needed $250,000. He said that between the high-priced bail bondsman and a top-tier defense attorney from a white shoe firm in Tampa, it was the only way to keep Chloe out of a state prison cell while they fought the charges. Chloe's hit and run wasn't just a tragic accident anymore. The police report had been aggravated by the fact that she was under the influence of those herbal supplements she had been peddling on her social media pages. The toxicology screen was going to be a nightmare. My father's voice cracked as he spoke about the liability. We will lose the house, Tiffany, he whispered. Everything your grandmother worked for, the legacy, the property, it will all be seized in a civil suit if we don't fix this now. He looked at me with a terrifying expectation. You have that trust fund your grandmother left you, he said. The one we told you was depleted to pay for your undergraduate years. It turns out there is a second part. A restricted tier that only matures and opens when you turn 30. I sat perfectly still, the plastic bench feeling cold beneath me. I stared at him, my mind rewinding through a decade of struggle. For 10 years, I had believed that my grandmother, the woman who used to bake lemon shortbread with me and tell me I was the brightest star in her sky, had left me with nothing but memories. When I was 19 and begging for help with my junior year tuition, my parents had sat me down at the kitchen table and told me the fund was gone. They said they had to use every penny to keep the family afloat during a rough patch in the real estate market. They watched me take on 3 jobs. They watched me eat ramen in a dark apartment while Chloe got a new wardrobe every season. They had been sitting on the truth for 10 long years, hoarding my inheritance like a secret weapon they only intended to fire when it suited their interests. You lied to me about the will for a decade, I said. My voice was a low, dangerous hum that seemed to chill the air in the small cafeteria. You watched me struggle. You watched me take out high-interest loans that I am still paying off today. You let me believe Grandma didn't care about my education. All the while, you were just waiting for a moment when you needed that money for yourselves. My mother, Linda, chimed in immediately, her voice rising in that high-pitched defensive warble she used whenever she was cornered. We were protecting the family, Tiffany, she insisted. She reached across the table to touch my arm, but I pulled away before her fingers could make contact. Chloe needed the stability. She was so fragile after the business failures, and we knew you were always so independent. You were a success story, Tiffany. You didn't need the money the way she did. We were just managing the resources to ensure everyone survived. Independence. There was that word again. In the Thatcher house, independence was the punishment for being capable. Because I could survive their neglect, they felt justified in inflicting it. Because I didn't fall apart, they felt entitled to strip my foundation and give the bricks to Chloe. They hadn't been managing resources. They had been committing a slow, calculated theft of my future to subsidize my sister's delusions of grandeur. How much is in it? I asked. My father hesitated, looking at his coffee cup. It's significant, he muttered. Enough to cover the bail, the retainer, and the initial settlements for the victim's family. The victim. He didn't say Mr. Harrison's name. He didn't mention the man who was currently being monitored for brain swelling in the next wing. He only saw the money as a way to make the problem go away. I realized then that my parents were not just enablers. They were predators who viewed their children as assets to be traded. Chloe was the asset that provided them with a sense of purpose through her constant need, and I was the asset that provided them with a safety net through my hard-earned success and my secret inheritance. The conflict wasn't just about the lie. It was about the utter lack of remorse in my father's eyes as he asked me to hand over the one thing my grandmother had tried to give me. He truly believed that his need outweighed my right to my own life. He believed that the Thatcher name was worth more than my 10 years of sacrifice. I thought about my grandmother, Eleanor. I remembered her holding my hand in her garden, telling me that one day I would understand why she pushed me so hard to be self-sufficient. I realized now that she knew. She knew David and Linda would try to devour whatever she left behind. The 30-year restriction wasn't a delay. It was a shield. She had been trying to protect me from them, waiting until I was old enough and strong enough to stand my ground when they finally came begging. You expect me to sign the release forms, I said. You want me to take the money meant for my future, the money Grandma intended for my practice and my children, and use it to buy a get-out-of-jail-free card for the person who nearly killed my mentor. It's the only way, David said, his voice regaining a bit of that old authoritarian edge. If you don't do this, we are all ruined. The litigation alone will bury us. Think about your mother. Think about where we will go if the house is gone. I looked at my mother. She was staring at me with a look of desperate hunger. She wasn't seeing her daughter. She was seeing a checkbook. I felt a surge of professional clarity. As a psychologist, I knew that if I signed those papers, I would be signing my own death warrant as an autonomous person. I would be tethering myself to their chaos forever. I would be validating every lie they ever told about me. I stood up from the bolted-down table. The screech of the plastic against the floor sounded like a scream. I am not signing anything I said, and I am not talking to your attorney. Tiffany, wait! Linda cried out, standing up so quickly she knocked her coffee over. You can't just leave us like this. We are your flesh and blood. Blood didn't stop you from lying to me for 10 years, I replied. Blood didn't stop you from stealing my identity to fund Chloe's influencer studio. You aren't worried about the family. You're worried about the audit. You're worried that once the court looks at Chloe's finances, they'll find your signatures on the fraud. My father's face went gray. The truth was out in the open now, raw and ugly under the flickering fluorescent lights. He knew I had put the pieces together. He knew the reliable child had finally stopped following orders. I turned and walked toward the exit of the cafeteria, my heels echoing in the hollow space. I could hear my father shouting behind me, calling me ungrateful, calling me a traitor. But the louder he got, the more certain I became. I reached the doors and stepped back into the main hallway of the precinct. As I walked toward the district attorney's office to follow through on my earlier threat, a new conflict emerged. I saw a familiar face standing by the water fountain. It was Sarah, the neighbor who had been giving me updates for years. She looked exhausted, her coat damp from the rain. "Tiffany, thank God I found you," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the cafeteria. "I saw your car. There's something else, something your father didn't tell you about the night of the accident. It wasn't just Chloe in that car." I stopped. The air felt thin again. "Who else was there?" I asked. Sarah leaned in, her voice barely a breath. "It was the lawyer Tiffany, the one your father wants you to hire. They were together before the crash, and he's the one who has the original copies of your grandmother's will. He isn't trying to save Chloe, he's trying to make sure you never find out what happened to the rest of the estate." The rabbit hole didn't just go deeper, it was a maze, and I was standing at the entrance with a single candle. The cold, digital chime of a text message vibrates against my palm, slicing through the heavy, stale air of the precinct hallway. I step away from the water fountain and Sarah's terrified gaze to look at the screen. It is the report from Marcus. I expected to see a trail of drained savings and perhaps some unauthorized credit card charges. What I am looking at instead is a clinical documented map of a betrayal so deep it makes the 10 years of stolen inheritance look like a petty disagreement. My phone screen glows with a list of high-interest business loans, equipment leases, and lines of credit, all secured since 2021. Every single one of them bears my social security number. Every single one of them lists Dr. Tiffany Thatcher as the primary guarantor. They hadn't just spent my past by depleting the trust fund my grandmother left me. They had been harvesting my future using the professional credentials I spent a decade building to fund Chloe's influencer studios and her string of failed lifestyle ventures. The hit and run isn't an isolated tragedy anymore. It is the loose thread on a garment of lies that, when pulled, unravels a multi-year criminal conspiracy committed by the people who gave me my name. My parents hadn't just ignored me for 5 years. They had been wearing my identity like a suit, walking into banks and digital lending platforms as me, while I was 200 miles away, helping strangers heal from the very trauma my family was actively inflicting on me. The realization is a physical blow to my stomach. I lean against the cold cinder block wall of the precinct, the blue light of the phone reflecting in my eyes. I am not just the invisible daughter. I am the involuntary financier of my sister's destruction. I walk back into the cafeteria, my heels sounding like a countdown on the linoleum. My father David is still hunched over the plastic table, his shoulders shaking with those deep, heaving sobs. He is talking about the Thatcher legacy, about how his father fought in the Pacific, and how this house is the last thing they have. But as I stand over him, I don't see a grieving patriarch. I see a cornered animal. My training as a psychologist allows me to peel back the layers of his performance. He isn't crying because Chloe might go to prison. He isn't crying because a 70-year-old man is fighting for his life in Bay 4. He is crying because he knows that a felony hit-and-run investigation involves a mandatory financial audit. He knows that once the state troopers and the insurance investigators start looking at the records of the vehicle involved, they will find the fraudulent policy Chloe signed in my name. And once they find that the house of cards collapses, they didn't call me at 2 a.m. to save Chloe. They called me because they realized that if I am not physically present to sign the rectification documents, the police will see the discrepancy within hours. I am the only one whose signature can retroactively authorize the loans and the insurance policy, effectively turning their criminal fraud into a family misunderstanding. They need me to become a co-conspirator to save their own skin. They are trying to draft me into their prison cell before the door even slams shut. David looks up at me, his eyes red and pleading, but now I see the calculation behind the tears. "Tiffany, the lawyer, says we just need you to verify the signatures on the studio lease," he says, his voice a desperate whisper. "It's just a formality. It will protect the house. It will keep the investigators from digging into things that don't matter. You're a doctor, Tiffany. You have so much to lose if this gets messy. Think about your own reputation. My own reputation. He is using my hard-earned life as a hostage. He is telling me that if I don't help them cover up their theft of my identity, my own career will be dragged through the mud of their audit. It is the ultimate narcissistic move, making the victim responsible for the perpetrator's survival. I look at my mother Linda, who is nodding frantically, her hands clasped as if in prayer. She isn't praying for Mr. Harrison. She is praying for the white colonial house and the social standing that depends on my silence. I realized then that the architecture of invisibility I grew up with was just the preparation for this moment. They spent 30 years making me feel like I didn't matter, so that when they finally needed to use me as a human shield, I wouldn't have the self-worth to say no. They thought the reliable child would still be there waiting for the one thing they never gave me: a place at the table. But they forgot that the table they are offering is inside a courtroom, and the meal is a 20-year sentence for wire fraud. The conflict isn't just about the money or the loans. It is the realization that my parents viewed my doctorate and my clinical license as tools for Chloe's vanity. While I was sitting with trauma survivors, helping them find the courage to speak their truth, my father was using my name to buy ring lights and velvet backdrops for a daughter who couldn't even keep a car in her own lane. The depth of the disrespect is staggering. They didn't just steal my money. They tried to steal the very essence of who I am. I take a step back from the table, my shadow stretching long across the cafeteria floor under the flickering fluorescent lights. The silence between us is no longer the silence of neglect. It is the silence of a standoff. My father watches me, his breath hitched in his throat, waiting for the reliable daughter to pick up the pen. He thinks he can still command me. He thinks the naval officer still has a subordinate. "You didn't just lie about the trust," I say, my voice sounding foreign in its absolute lack of emotion. "You used my social security number for 6 different business loans. You forged my name on an insurance policy 3 weeks ago. You turned me into a ghost so you could use my life as collateral for Chloe's fantasies. And now you're asking me to sign papers that would make me legally responsible for the fraud you committed." Linda lets out a sharp, choked sound. "We were going to tell you, Tiffany. We were just waiting for Chloe's big break. She was so close to a national sponsorship. We thought we could pay everything back and you'd never even have to know. We did it for you, too. So you'd have a sister you could be proud of. The logic is so warped, it feels like vertigo. They committed identity theft against me to give me a sister I could be proud of. The layers of the lie are so thick, they've become their own reality." I look at the pen on the table, the one the lawyer left there. It represents the final choice. If I sign, I preserve the Thatcher name and the Sarasota house, but I lose my soul. I become a liar just like them. If I refuse, I watch my parents and my sister go to prison, but I walk away with the truth. I think about Mr. Harrison in Bay 4. I think about the man who taught me that history is made by the people who refuse to look away from the truth. If I sign these papers, I am telling the world that Mr. Harrison's life was worth less than my father's Buick. I am telling the world that the Thatcher legacy is more important than justice. I reach out and pick up the pen. My father's eyes light up with a sudden predatory hope. My mother exhales a sob of relief. They think they've won. They think the invisible daughter has finally come home. I hold the pen over the document for a heartbeat, watching my father's hands reach out as if to guide mine. Then I press down and snap the plastic barrel in half. The black ink leaks out, staining the white paper like a spreading bruise. The hope in my father's eyes vanishes, replaced by a rage so cold it makes the Florida night feel like winter. "You ungrateful, selfish bitch," he whispers, the mask of the grieving father finally falling away to reveal the monster beneath. "We gave you everything. We made you who you are. And you're going to let us rot because you're still holding a grudge about a dinner." I look at him, and for the first time in 31 years, I don't feel the need to explain myself. I don't feel the need to shrink. I am Dr. Tiffany Thatcher, and I am the only one in this room who isn't a criminal. I turn my back on them and walk toward the exit. But as I reach the heavy double doors, I see the district attorney walking toward the cafeteria, flanked by two uniformed officers. They aren't looking for Chloe. They are looking at the document my father is currently trying to hide under his coat. The audit has already started, and the thread is being pulled faster than I ever imagined. The conflict is no longer a family secret. It is a public execution of a reputation that never actually existed. I realized then that I don't have to destroy them. They've already done the work for me. I just have to decide if I'm going to stay to watch the debris fall. I leave my parents in the sterile fluorescent-lit cafeteria, their voices rising in a desperate chorus of ungrateful and traitor behind me. The sound of my heels on the linoleum is the only thing anchoring me as I walk back through the heavy double doors into the secured hospital wing. I push into Bay 4, the smell of antiseptic catching in my throat, and find the rhythm of the machines has changed. The heart monitor is faster, more insistent. Mr. Harrison is awake. His eyes, though surrounded by deep purple bruising and the puffiness of trauma, are clear and focused. When he sees me, a flicker of recognition softens the tension in his face. He reaches out a hand, his skin looking like translucent paper over bird-like bones, and I take it. His grip is surprisingly firm, a final spark of the man who once refused to let me fail. Tiffany, he rasps, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I saw the car. It was your father's old Buick, the white one with the navy pinstripe. I remember it from the school parking lot all those years ago. The girl behind the wheel, she didn't even tap the brakes. She just kept coming. I feel the weight of the $250,000 bail request and the forged loan documents inside my bag like they are made of lead. If I sign those papers, if I use the trust fund my grandmother tried to hide from their greed, I save my parents from a federal fraud investigation. I save Chloe from a decade in a state facility. I keep the white colonial house in Sarasota from being seized by the bank. I can make the nightmare stop for the people who share my DNA. But in doing so, I would be betraying the only person who ever looked at me and saw a human being instead of a tool. I am so sorry, Mr. Harrison. I whisper, my voice thick with a grief that has been sitting in my chest for 20 years. I am sorry she did this to you. I am sorry they are asking me to choose them over the truth. I look at him, this man who spent his life teaching American history, a man who believed that the soul of a country was found in the integrity of its individuals. He looks back at me with the same terrifying clarity he had in 10th grade, when he told me that I was the only person who could decide my own value. Don't be sorry, Tiffany, he says, his voice gaining a sudden gravelly strength. Be the person I knew you would be. Don't let them make you a co-conspirator in your own erasure. They have spent your whole life trying to turn you into a ghost so they could use your light to guide their favorite daughter. If you sign those papers, you aren't saving them. You are just letting them finish the job of disappearing you. The conflict in the room isn't just about a hit and run anymore. It is a war for my own existence. My background as a psychologist tells me that my parents are currently engaged in a final desperate act of parentification. They want the child to pay for the sins of the adults. They want me to absorb their legal and financial liability so they can keep their reputation intact at the country club. They are counting on the reliable daughter, the one who always figures it out, to sacrifice her own professional license and her grandmother's legacy to keep their lies afloat. But looking at Mr. Harrison, I realize that the cost of being the reliable child is far too high. It would cost me my soul. I stand up slowly, the hand that held his now curling into a fist. I have made my decision. It isn't the reliable one. It isn't the one that keeps the peace or prevents the drama. It is the just one. I realize that for 31 years I have been setting a table for people who were never going to show up unless they were hungry for my resources. I am done. I walk out of Bay 4 without looking back, leaving the soft beep of the monitors behind me. I don't go back to the cafeteria. I don't go back to the parents who are currently rehearsing their next manipulation. I walk straight to the intake desk, where the detective is finishing his report. I need to make a formal statement. I tell him, my voice sounding like steel. Not just about the car. I have evidence of identity theft and financial fraud involving the driver and the registered owner of the vehicle. I see the detective's eyebrows shoot up as he reaches for a fresh pad of paper. Behind him, through the glass of the lobby, I see my father standing up, his face lighting up with a predatory hope, because he thinks I am finally coming to sign the bail papers. He has no idea that I am currently handing the police the matches to the very house of cards he is trying to protect. The shift in the room is electric. My father pushes through the doors, his naval commander's stride returning for a final, arrogant moment. "Tiffany, the lawyer, is waiting in the hallway," he says, ignoring the detective. "We need to move now before the morning shift change. Let's get this over with so we can go home." I don't look at him. I look at the detective. "I would also like to report that the signatures on the business loans for Chloe's studio were forged," I say. "And I would like to initiate a full audit of my grandmother, Eleanor Thatcher's estate." I saw the air leave my father's lungs. The military posture didn't just fail, it collapsed. He took a step back, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. "You're destroying us," he whispered, the rage finally replacing the desperation. "You're going to let your sister rot in a cell because of a teacher who doesn't even remember your name." "He remembers exactly who I am," I replied, finally meeting his gaze. "That's the problem, Dad. He remembers me, and now for the first time so do I." But as I say the words, a new sharper conflict emerges. The public defender runs into the hallway, his face the color of ash. "Detective, we just got the secondary scan from the hospital," he says, his voice shaking. "Mr. Harrison isn't the only victim. There was a second pedestrian involved in the crash that the witnesses didn't see at first. A young woman. We just found her in the ditch 2 miles back." I feel the floor tilt again. The hit and run wasn't just one mistake. It was a trail of bodies. And as the lawyer says the name of the second victim, I realize that the web Chloe spun is so tangled, it has managed to snare the only other person I ever loved. The sisterly sacrifice wasn't just about money, it was about the blood that was currently staining the Florida asphalt. The clock on the precinct wall strikes 8 a.m. with a mechanical click that feels like a final judgment. I walk back into the cafeteria, my heels striking the linoleum with a precision that masks the cold fury vibrating in my veins. The space is still bathed in that sickly, flickering fluorescent light that makes everyone look like a ghost of themselves. My parents are no longer alone. Sitting with them is a man in a sharp charcoal suit, a silver silk tie, and a briefcase that looks like it cost more than my first car. This is the fixer my father mentioned. This is the man who was with Chloe before she hit the gas. He is waiting for me with a stack of papers spread across the plastic table like a feast of lies. Linda sees me first. Her eyes aren't red anymore. They are bright, with a frantic, predatory hope. She stands up, smoothing her skirt, and pushes a heavy fountain pen toward me. "Sign here, honey," she says, her voice returning to that sweet, manipulative syrup she uses when she wants to bury a body. The lawyer has everything ready. We just need to consolidate the loans. Once you sign, the bank stops the audit. The insurance company accepts the policy as valid, and we can all go home. We can forget this nightmare ever happened. We can be a family again, Tiffany. Just one signature, and the slate is clean. I pick up the pen. It is heavy, cold, and expensive. I look down at the document on top of the pile. My training in forensic psychology and my years of dealing with high-conflict contracts allow me to see exactly what this is. It isn't a consolidation of loans. It is a confession of judgment. By signing this, I am not just helping them. I am legally admitting that I authorized every single fraudulent loan they took out in my name. I am tying myself to Chloe's $250,000 debt, effectively becoming the primary debtor to clear my father's name. If I sign this, I am agreeing to pay for my sister's influencer lifestyle and my father's criminal enabling for the rest of my life. I would be a slave to their choices until the day I die. I look at David. He is watching me with a smug, expectant expression. He truly believes he has won. He thinks that because he is the naval commander, and I am the reliable child, I will fall into line. He thinks the 5 years of silence was just a tantrum that has finally burned itself out. He sees my doctorate and my success not as my own achievement, but as a resource that belongs to him. He is waiting for the subordinate to execute the order. You really thought I was still that 16-year-old girl waiting for a birthday cake that never came, I say. My voice is low, steady, and filled with a clarity that seems to stop the air in the room. You thought you could ignore me for 5 years, steal my identity to fund Chloe's delusions, and then summon me at 2 in the morning to save your skin. You thought I would be so desperate for a seat at your table that I would pay $250,000 to sit there. Tiffany, don't be dramatic, my father bellows, the old authority returning to his tone. This is about the house. This is about your sister. You have the money. You have the life. It is your duty to protect this family. I look at the pen in my hand. I think about the Greyhound bus I took to the state championship alone. I think about the empty seats at my graduation. I think about Mr. Harrison's bruised face in Bay 4. Then I press my thumbs against the center of the fountain pen and snap it in half. The black ink explodes, splattering across the confession of judgment, staining the white paper like a spreading bruise. The silver tie of the lawyer is ruined. My mother screams a sharp, ugly sound that echoes off the tiled walls. Tiffany, what are you doing? David roars, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. You just destroyed the only way out. I am resigning, I say, setting the broken pieces of the pen on the table. I am resigning from this family. I am resigning from being the unpaid staff who cleans up your messes. And I am resigning from being the person who pays for Chloe's sins. You wanted me to be strong, Dad. You told me my entire life that I didn't need you because I was so capable. Well, you were right. I am capable of walking out of this precinct and letting the law handle the people who tried to erase me. The lawyer stands up, dabbing at his tie with a napkin, his eyes darting between my father and me. Dr. Thatcher, you realize that if you don't sign, the police will proceed with the identity theft investigation, he says, his voice sounding like a threat disguised as advice. Your father and sister could face federal charges. I hope they have good representation, I reply, because I am walking over to the district attorney's office right now to tell them that the signatures on those loans aren't mine. I am going to tell them that my sister forged my medical license number, and I am going to tell them that my father knew about every single cent of it. Linda collapses back onto the plastic bench, her face finally revealing the raw, jagged terror she has been hiding. You can't do this, Tiffany. We're your parents. We gave you everything. You gave me a role, I say, looking at her with a pity that finally replaces my anger. You gave me the role of the backup daughter. You gave me the role of the insurance policy. But I'm canceling the coverage. The house in Sarasota. The reputation, the legacy. It's all gone. And it isn't because of me. It's because you chose a lie over a daughter for 30 years. I turn my back on them. I don't wait for the next outburst. I don't wait for the guilt trip that I know is coming. I walk out of the cafeteria and toward the main hallway of the precinct. I feel lighter with every step, as if I am shedding a physical weight that has been crushing my spine since I was a child. I am no longer the reliable child. I am no longer the invisible one. I am a woman who has finally decided that her own life is worth more than a narcissist's comfort. As I reach the exit, I see the district attorney walking toward me, flanked by 2 detectives. They aren't looking for the hit-and-run file anymore. They are carrying a laptop and a folder full of banking records. One of them looks at me and nods. Dr. Thatcher, we just got the remote access to the studio's server, he says. There is a secondary set of books. It looks like your sister wasn't just selling herbal supplements. She was using your professional name to run an illegal prescription mill out of that studio. I freeze. The floor seems to disappear beneath my feet. The conflict wasn't just about identity theft. It was about my clinical authority being used to distribute controlled substances. The hit and run was the distraction. The real crime was a medical conspiracy that could end my career and put me in a federal prison right next to my sister. I realized then that the 8 a.m. confrontation was just the beginning. The fixer wasn't there to save Chloe. He was there to make sure I signed those papers before the police found the prescriptions. My own family hadn't just stolen my money, they had set me up to be the fall girl for a drug ring. The drama didn't just increase, it became a fight for my very freedom. I do not walk out of the precinct doors. The humid Florida morning air is visible through the thick glass, heavy and promising a storm, but I turn my back on the exit. Instead, I follow the signs down a secondary corridor toward the district attorney's office, located in the north wing of the same municipal complex. Every step I take feels like I am stripping away layers of a costume I never asked to wear. I am no longer the shield. I am no longer the buffer. My heels strike the floor with a rhythmic finality that mirrors the ticking of the clock I have been racing against since 2 in the morning. When I reach the glass partition of the clerk's desk, I don't hesitate. I pull my phone from my blazer pocket, the screen still glowing with the forensic accountant's map of my family's betrayal. My name is Dr. Tiffany Thatcher. I say, my voice projecting with a clinical authority that makes the clerk look up from her monitor. I am here to report multi-year identity theft and systemic financial fraud. I also have evidence that the registered owner of the vehicle involved in the Harrison hit and run was fully aware of the driver's habitual intoxication and previous mechanical negligence. I hand over my phone, which now contains the digital records from Marcus and the voice recording of the conversation I just had in the cafeteria. The recording is clear. You can hear my father's voice, the naval commander turned criminal enabler, demanding that I sign a confession of judgment to hide his tracks. You can hear the fixer in the background dabbing at his silk tie while he waits for me to commit a felony for the sake of the family name. The clerk's expression shifts from standard bureaucratic boredom to sharp, focused attention. She calls for a duty prosecutor. As I wait in the small partitioned office, I look through the window that faces the internal courtyard of the precinct. I see them. My father David and my mother Linda are being led by 2 detectives toward a secure interview room. David's gait is no longer a march, it is a shuffle. He looks like a man who has finally realized that his rank doesn't mean anything in a room where everyone has the receipts. Linda is clutching her designer handbag like a life raft, her head darting left and right looking for an audience for the performance she is about to give. Across the hall, I see a glimpse of Chloe through a reinforced glass panel. She is being processed for the felony. The designer clothes she wore to the club are rumpled and her hair, usually perfectly styled for her followers, is a tangled mess. There is no bail bondsman waiting for her. There is no high-priced fixer. The man in the charcoal suit has vanished, likely realizing that his association with the Thatcher family is now a professional liability. Chloe looks small. For the first time in 27 years, she is in a room where her tears won't change the temperature or the outcome. Linda catches sight of me through the glass as they lead her past. Her face contorts into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She stops, resisting the detective's hand on her arm, and screams my name. The sound is muffled by the thick safety glass, but the shape of the words is unmistakable. "You are destroying us," she shrieks, her fingers clawing at the air. "We are your parents. How could you do this to your own blood?" I stand my ground. I don't look away. I don't feel the familiar sting of guilt that used to keep me awake at 3 in the morning. I feel a strange, quiet peace. "No," I say, even though I know she can't hear me. "You destroyed yourselves. I am just the one who stopped holding up the ruins." The weight of that sentence is monumental. I realized then that my entire role in the family had been that of a structural support. I was the one who worked the extra hours, who kept the reputation polished, and who absorbed the shocks of Chloe's disasters so the house stayed standing. My parents didn't love me for who I was. They loved me for the stability I provided. And the moment I decided to move my shoulder out from under their weight, the house collapsed because the foundation was already rotted through. The prosecutor, a woman with tired eyes and a sensible haircut, walks into the room with my phone. "Dr. Thatcher, this forensic report is incredibly detailed," she says, sitting across from me. "It looks like your sister wasn't just using your name for loans. She was using your medical NPI number to authorize the purchase of bulk pharmaceutical supplies for her wellness brand. Supplements that aren't actually herbal. The conflict shifts from financial betrayal to professional survival. If my medical identifiers were used to purchase controlled substances, my license is at the center of a federal investigation. My parents didn't just steal my credit. They risked my ability to ever practice medicine again. They traded my life's work for a chance at a viral sponsorship. The layers of the betrayal are so deep, it feels like I am looking into a canyon with no bottom. I take a deep breath and look at the prosecutor. "I want to cooperate fully," I say. "I want to provide every record, every email, and every bank statement I have. I am not just a victim of identity theft. I am a doctor whose reputation has been weaponized by the people who were supposed to protect it." She nods, her pen moving quickly across a legal pad. "Your father is claiming he was unaware of the fraud," she observes. "He is saying that you gave Chloe permission to use your credentials years ago and that you're only reporting this now because of a personal grudge." I laugh, a cold, dry sound. "He's a naval officer," I tell her. "He doesn't do anything without a paper trail. Ask him for the authorization forms. Ask him for the emails where I supposedly gave that permission. He won't have them because they don't exist. He's spent 30 years lying to keep Chloe happy, and now he thinks he can lie to keep himself out of prison." As I finish my statement, the sun finally breaks through the clouds outside, casting long, sharp shadows across the linoleum. The precinct is beginning to bustle with the morning shift. Officers are walking by with bags of donuts and files, completely unaware that a 30-year family dynasty is being dismantled in the North Wing. I feel a sense of absolute autonomy. I am no longer a daughter waiting for a cake that will never come. I am a woman who has finally set her own table. But as I stand up to leave, the detective from the hospital wing walks into the office. He looks even more exhausted than he did at dawn. "Dr. Thatcher, Mr. Harrison is out of surgery," he says. "He's stable, but he's asking for you. And there is something else. We found a passenger in the car your sister hit. Not the second pedestrian, but someone who was actually in the Buick with Chloe when she fled." I feel a cold shiver down my spine. "Who was it?" I ask. "It was your mother's sister, your Aunt Martha," the detective says. "She was in the back seat. She's currently in the ICU. And she's telling a very different story about who was actually driving that car when it left the club." The conflict doesn't just deepen, it twists into a new, terrifying shape. If Chloe wasn't the only one in the car, and if there is a dispute about who was behind the wheel, the entire case against my sister might be a smokescreen for a much bigger lie involving my mother. I realized that the 2 a.m. call wasn't just about Chloe. It was about a conspiracy that involves every single person in that house except for me. I am the only one with clean hands, and that makes me the biggest threat they have ever faced. I walk toward the ICU, knowing that the truth is about to get much more expensive. 3 months have passed since the storm at the precinct, and the Florida humidity has given way to a dry, biting heat that feels like a desert. I am standing on the sidewalk in Sarasota, watching a man in a neon vest hammer a sign into the manicured grass of my childhood home. "Auction," it says, in bold, uncompromising letters. Underneath, in smaller type, it mentions the seizure by the state. The white colonial house with the navy shutters, the stage where my parents performed their lives for 30 years, is being liquidated. The proceeds are not going toward a comfortable retirement or a new venture for Chloe. Every cent is being siphoned into a court-mandated restitution fund to pay the victims of the fraudulent loans and the mounting medical expenses for Mr. Harrison. My parents are no longer the pillars of this community. They are living in a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town, a place that smells of old cigarettes and desperation, where the walls are thin enough to hear the neighbors' televisions. They are currently awaiting trial for multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. The high-powered social circle they cultivated has vanished, replaced by a revolving door of public defenders and forensic auditors. Chloe is in a state facility, her influencer accounts deactivated by court order, finally facing a reality where her tears don't change the laws of physics or the rules of a courtroom. She is learning that in the real world, accountability is not a brand deal you can decline. The realtor has given me 1 hour to collect any personal belongings I might have left behind before the doors are locked for the final time. I walk through the front entrance, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. The house is empty. The mahogany dining table where I sat in silence for 2 decades is gone, sold to cover a legal retainer. The expensive art my mother used to hide her insecurities has been stripped from the walls, leaving pale rectangles on the paint, like ghostly reminders of things that weren't real. I walk through the kitchen where I used to do everyone's taxes while they ignored my presence, and I feel nothing but a profound sense of relief. It is the same silence you experience after a long, invasive surgery, the kind where the surgeon finally removes the necrotic tissue that has been poisoning your system for years. It isn't a happy silence, but it is a healing one. I wander into the garage, a place that always smelled of my father's motor oil and repressed anger. It is cluttered with the debris of Chloe's failed businesses. There are boxes of those organic soaps now hardened and gray, and stacks of velvet backdrops for videos that no one will ever watch. I move a heavy rusted water heater in the corner, looking for a box of old books I thought I might have left behind. Instead, I find something else. Tucked behind the copper pipes covered in a thick layer of spiderwebs and dust is a small plastic trophy with a gold-colored figure of a speaker at a podium. It is my state debate championship trophy from when I was 15. I pick it up, the plastic feeling light and cheap in my hand. They hadn't even kept it in the house. While Chloe's finger paintings were framed in the hallway and her participation ribbons were displayed on the mantel. The only tangible proof of my teenage potential had been shoved behind a utility appliance in a dark garage. It was the physical manifestation of my entire childhood. I was something to be hidden, something to be used for parts, but never something to be celebrated. I wipe the dust from the base with my thumb and read my name. Tiffany Thatcher, first place. I realize then that I don't feel revenge. Revenge requires you to still care about the person you are hurting. I don't hate my father for hiding this. I don't hate my mother for forgetting it. I simply don't belong to them anymore. I take the trophy and walk back out to my car. I have already spent the morning at the hospital with Mr. Harrison. He is walking with a cane now, his mind as sharp as ever, though his body is a map of the trauma Chloe inflicted. We don't talk about the crash, we talk about the future. I have used the restricted part of my grandmother's trust, the part she hid behind a 30-year lock because she knew her own son was a predator, to establish a nonprofit organization. I called it the Harrison Second Chance Fund. It provides legal and financial advocacy for students in the foster care system, kids who are the reliable ones, the invisible ones, the ones who are being erased by the very systems meant to protect them. I am using my grandmother's legacy to ensure that other children don't have to wait 30 years to be seen. As I put the trophy in my trunk, I see my mother's car pull into the driveway. It is a battered sedan she bought with the last of her jewelry money. She gets out looking older, her hair unkempt, the polished mask of the charity board member completely shattered. She looks at the auction sign and then at me. "Tiffany, please," she says, her voice lacking its usual manipulative honey. "Your father is falling apart. He's talking about things he can't take back. If you just told the prosecutor that you gave us verbal permission for those loans, we could stop the auction. We could save the family name. You're a doctor. People listen to you." I look at her, and for the first time in my life, I don't see a mother. I see a stranger who is asking me to commit perjury to save a house that was built on my own silence. I realize that even now, with the sirens fading and the handcuffs clicking, she still thinks I am the backup daughter. She still thinks my purpose is to be the sacrifice. The family name died the night Chloe left Mr. Harrison in the street, I say. I am not the daughter you raised to be a shield mom. I am the woman who finally realized that blood isn't a contract. I've already given my final statement to the district attorney. They have the recordings. They have the forensic audit. There is no version of this story where I lie for you. Linda's face twists, the desperation turning into a sharp, ugly venom. You think you're so much better than us because you have that degree, she spits. You're just like your father, cold, calculating. You're going to let your sister rot in a cell because you want to play hero with a fund for strangers. You're heartless, Tiffany. I start my car, the engine humming a steady, reliable tune. If being heartless means I no longer let you use my heart as a stepping stone, then I'll accept the title I say. I back out of the driveway, leaving her standing on the sidewalk of a home she no longer owns. I don't look in the rearview mirror. I am driving toward Boca Raton, toward Mark, and toward a life that is entirely mine. The silence of the drive is broken by a notification on my phone. It is my attorney. He tells me that the audit of the estate is complete, and there is a final discrepancy in the probate records from my grandmother's death. It turns out that the house in Sarasota wasn't the only property Eleanor Thatcher owned. There is a small cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains that was never listed in the original will. My father had hidden the deed, intending to use it as a getaway for Chloe once the heat from the loans died down. But because of the audit I triggered, the court has discovered it. And because of a specific clause in my grandmother's handwritten notes, the cabin doesn't belong to the estate. It was deeded directly to me 10 years ago. The conflict takes one last sharp turn. I own the only piece of land my father has left to run to. As I pull into my own driveway in Boca, I realize that I hold the keys to his final escape. He is going to call me. He is going to beg. He is going to try to use the memory of my grandmother to guilt me into giving him that cabin. But as I look at the small debate trophy sitting on my passenger seat, I realize that the architecture of my life is finally finished. I don't need to give him anything. I just need to decide if I'm going to sell the cabin to fund 5 more scholarships, or if I'm going to go there myself and enjoy the silence of a house that was never built on lies. I step out of the car, and for the first time in 31 years, the air feels like it belongs to me. The humidity of Boca Raton sticks to the glass windows of my office, but inside the air is crisp and controlled. My practice has grown into a sanctuary for those seeking to untangle themselves from the invisible threads of family obligation. I am sitting at my desk, a solid piece of walnut that I bought with my own earnings, when my assistant brings in the morning mail. On top of the stack is a thick, cream-colored envelope that feels out of place among the medical journals and insurance statements. There is no return address, just a postmark from the county correctional facility. I don't need a return name to know whose handwriting is slanted across the front. It is the same loopy entitled script that used to fill my parents' refrigerator with lists of things Chloe wanted for her birthdays. I open it with a silver letter opener, my movements methodical. The letter inside smells faintly of the cheap laundry soap used in state institutions. Tiffet begins. The nickname alone feels like a violation, a reach into a past I have spent 5 years buried under concrete. It is so cold here, she writes. Mom and Dad are depressed. They have lost so much weight, and Dad cries every time he looks at the empty spaces in their rental where the furniture used to be. If you could just talk to the district attorney, tell them it was all a giant mistake. Tell them you authorized the loans, and we just got the paperwork mixed up. We can be a family again, Tiff. We can go back to the way things were. I read the words, and I can almost hear the tremor in her voice, the practiced vibration she used to get out of speeding tickets and chemistry finals. It is the same old script, the one where the world is a series of misunderstandings and I am the only person with the magic eraser. But then comes the hook, the ultimate golden child manipulation tool. I'm pregnant, Tiff. You're going to be an aunt. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Does our blood mean so little that you would let your niece or nephew grow up while their mother is behind bars? A glossy slip of paper falls out of the envelope and lands on my desk. It is an ultrasound photo, a grainy black and white image of a life that hasn't even begun yet. For a staggering, heart-stopping second, the old Tiffany, the reliable child who was trained to absorb every shock and fix every fracture, wants to reach for the phone. I feel the phantom weight of that 16-year-old girl who would have given her own marrow to see her parents smile. I think about the baby, a new life entering the Thatcher orbit, and I feel the familiar pull of the guilt that David and Linda spent decades installing in my brain. But then I shift my gaze. Sitting right next to that ultrasound is a framed photograph from last month. It was taken at the inaugural gala for the Harrison Second Chance Fund. In the photo, I am standing next to Mr. Harrison. He is wearing a tuxedo that fits a little loosely now, and he is leaning heavily on a mahogany cane, but his eyes are bright and full of a fierce, quiet joy. He is walking. He is breathing. He is alive because I chose the truth over a lie. I look at the man Chloe nearly killed, and then I look back at the grainy image of the child she is carrying. The psychological clarity hits me like a splash of ice water. The child Chloe is carrying doesn't need me to lie for its mother. That child deserves a better story than the one Chloe, David, and Linda have been writing for generations. If I sign those papers, if I lie to the district attorney and pull my family out of the ruins they built, I am inviting that baby into a house of mirrors. I am validating a cycle of fraud, enabling an erasure that will eventually consume that child, just like it tried to consume me. The greatest act of love I can show to a niece or nephew I haven't met is to ensure they grow up knowing that actions have consequences and that the truth is not a negotiable commodity. My background in developmental trauma tells me that children don't need perfect parents, but they do need honest ones. They need a world that makes sense. By letting Chloe face the state facility, by letting David and Linda face the jury, I am providing the only foundation of integrity that child will ever have. I am stopping the rot before it reaches the next generation. I am not being heartless. I am being a guardian of a future that hasn't been poisoned yet. I look at the ultrasound one last time. I see the potential for a human being who might be brilliant, or kind, or quiet, or loud. A human being who should never be told they are a golden child or a scapegoat. I think about my grandmother Eleanor, and the way she must have felt watching her own son become a man who would steal from his daughter. She tried to warn me with her silence and her secret trust. She knew that sometimes the only way to save a family is to let the toxic parts of it fall away. I pick up a black felt-tip pen. I don't write a long letter. I don't explain my clinical reasoning or list the grievances of the last decade. I don't mention the anniversary dinner or the graduation. I turn the cream-colored envelope over and write a single crystalline sentence on the back. Family isn't a debt you pay for someone else's choices. Good luck, Chloe. I slide the ultrasound back into the envelope and seal it. I walk to the outgoing mail bin in the hallway and drop it in. The sound of the envelope hitting the bottom is the final punctuation mark on a 30-year sentence. I feel a sense of absolute, unshakable autonomy. I am no longer waiting for their permission to be happy. I am no longer looking for their approval of my boundaries. I am a woman who has realized that her worth is not a currency to be spent on other people's bail. The conflict of the golden child's return is over, but the silence that follows is not empty. It is a full, vibrant silence. I walk back into my office and look at the clock. It is 9 a.m. My first client of the day is a young woman who was told she was the difficult one because she dared to move out of her parents' basement. She is sitting in the waiting room, her hands shaking, her eyes full of the same fear I used to carry like a second skin. I open my door and smile at her. I don't see a difficult girl. I see a survivor. I see a woman who is about to learn that she doesn't owe anyone her life. As I sit down across from her, I realize that my parents and Chloe were right about one thing. I am very, very good at what I do, and what I do is help people walk through the doors they've been told are locked. But as the session ends, I receive an urgent notification from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. It isn't about Chloe or the trial. It is a notice of a civil deposition. It turns out that the victim in the second hit and run, the young woman found in the ditch, has filed a lawsuit. But she isn't suing Chloe or David. She is suing me. She is claiming that as the primary medical professional listed on the fraudulent business loans for the studio, I am legally responsible for the actions of the employees working there. The web hasn't just snagged me, it is trying to pull me into the center of the trap. My family didn't just use my name to buy lights. They used it to shield themselves from the blood on the road. The final conflict is no longer a moral choice. It is a legal ambush that threatens to strip me of the very practice I just used to find my freedom. I realize that the surprising ending is not just about walking away. It is about the one person my family never told me was in that car, a person whose presence changes the legal logic of the entire night. The drive from the Sarasota courthouse back to Boca Raton is long, but for the first time in my life, the miles don't feel like a burden. The Florida sunset is bleeding gold and violet across the horizon, reflecting off the hood of my car as I pull into my driveway. The salt air from the coast is cool and inviting a sharp contrast to the stagnant, heavy atmosphere of the legal offices I have spent the last few weeks navigating. I walk toward my front door, the key turning smoothly in the lock. I am no longer looking over my shoulder for the ghosts of my family's expectations. I am walking into a house that I built, a life that belongs entirely to me. Inside, the lights are low and the smell of roasted garlic and rosemary fills the foyer. My husband Mark is in the kitchen, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the pendant lights. He hears me enter and looks up, his smile the kind of steady anchor I once thought didn't exist in the real world. "Hey," he says softly, "dinner is almost ready, but we have a guest." I walk into the dining room expecting perhaps Mr. Harrison or a colleague from the clinic. Instead, I stop in my tracks. Sitting at the walnut table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, is my mother, Linda. She isn't wearing the designer silk or the expensive jewelry she used to armor herself with in Sarasota. She is wearing a simple cotton sweater, and her hair is pulled back in a way that makes her look younger, yet more tired. She looks up at me, and for the first time in 31 years, the performative mask is gone. There are no dramatic tears. There is no manipulative syrup in her voice. There is only a raw, quiet exhaustion. To understand why my mother is sitting in my dining room while my father and sister are facing federal indictments, you have to look at the documents the forensic auditor uncovered during the final week of the investigation. While I was digging through the identity theft and the fraudulent loans, I found a secondary layer of the conspiracy that even I hadn't anticipated. For 40 years, my father David had been the ultimate architect of our family's destruction. He hadn't just used me as a shield, he had been using my mother as his primary legal fall girl since the day they were married. The audit revealed that David never put his own name on a single fraudulent document. Every high-interest loan, every forged signature on Chloe's studio leases, and every unauthorized withdrawal from my grandmother's estate had been funneled through accounts in Linda's name. He had spent 4 decades parentifying his own wife, turning her into the bookkeeper for his lies, while he held the actual keys to the accounts. He told her what to sign, told her what to say to the neighbors, and told her that if she ever questioned him, the family would collapse, and it would be her fault. My mother wasn't just an enabler. She was a hostage who had been trained to believe she was a partner in the crime. When the district attorney showed me the evidence, I realized that my mother was facing 20 years for a legacy of fraud she didn't even understand. I went to her rental apartment 2 weeks ago, and for the first time I didn't speak to her as the difficult daughter. I spoke to her as a doctor. I laid the documents out on the stained linoleum of her kitchen table and showed her the trail of ink that David had left behind. I told her she had a choice. She could continue to protect the man who had already traded her freedom for his own comfort, or she could testify against him and Chloe and finally tell the truth. I told her that David wasn't going to save her. I showed her the emails where he was already blaming her for the insurance lapse and the identity theft. I offered her a lifeline, but it came with a price: absolute honesty. She had to choose the daughter who actually mattered over the man who had erased her identity. For 3 days, she didn't answer my calls. I thought she was going to go down with the ship, a final victim of the Thatcher family pride. Then she called me from the prosecutor's office. She told them everything. She told them about the midnight signatures, the secret bank accounts David kept in the Cayman Islands, and the way he had coached Chloe to use my credentials. She chose herself, and in doing so, she finally chose me. Mark walks into the dining room carrying a tray of plates. I reach out and take them from him. In the Thatcher house, the table was always a site of conflict. It was where I was ignored, where Chloe was indulged, and where the hierarchy was reinforced with every meal. But tonight, as I set the table, I feel a profound sense of realignment. I am not setting 4 plates. I am not leaving a space for a naval commander who is currently sitting in a jail cell or a sister who is still waiting for a miracle that isn't coming. I set 3 plates. One for Mark, one for me, and one for the woman who is staying in our guest suite while she learns how to be a person instead of a puppet. My mother watches me, her eyes following the movement of the china. She looks at the 3rd plate as if it's the most beautiful thing she's ever seen. It represents a life where she doesn't have to lie to keep her seat. I sit down across from her and pour the wine. The silence in the room is not heavy or jagged. It is the silence of a house that is finally built on a solid foundation. My mother reaches out and touches the edge of her glass, her fingers steady. "Tiffany," she whispers, "I'm so sorry it took me this long to see the lights." I look at her and I see the decades of damage, the scars of being David's subordinate, and the fear of a woman who is starting over at 68. But I also see the woman my grandmother Eleanor always said was hidden beneath the surface. I see a survivor. "Boundaries aren't walls, Mom," I say, echoing the words my grandmother wrote on the back of a graduation card she knew I wouldn't receive until it was too late. "They're doors. They tell people where the damage ends and where the life begins. For 30 years, I was the one holding up the ruins of your house. But I'm finished with that job. I'm finally the one with the keys to my own home." We eat in a quiet, comfortable rhythm. The sounds of the Florida night drift in through the open windows, the distant hum of the ocean providing a soundtrack to a dinner that was 30 years in the making. There is no mention of Chloe's latest legal filing or David's attempts to reach us from the correctional facility. Those people belong to a story that has already been told. The payoff of my life wasn't the doctorate or the successful practice or even the $1 million fund for foster kids. It was this. The moment I realized that I didn't have to be the reliable child or the invisible daughter. I just had to be the one who refused to look away from the truth. I look at my mother, who is actually laughing at a joke Mark made, and I realize that by saving myself, I accidentally gave her the chance to save herself too. The final scene of my family drama isn't a courtroom or an auction. It is a quiet dinner in Boca Raton where the truth is the guest of honor. I look at the 3 plates and I smile. The keys in my pocket feel heavy and real. I have built my own table, and for the first time, everyone sitting at it actually belongs there. The screen fades to black on the sound of the Atlantic tide pulling the sand back out to sea, washing away the footprints of a family that no longer has the power to follow me home. My name is Dr. Tiffany Thatcher, and I am finally the only architect of my own life. I sat on my porch in Boca Raton, the small debate trophy resting on the side table next to a glass of iced tea. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in a bruised state of indigo and violet. Inside the house, I could hear the muffled, steady sound of my mother loading the dishwasher, a domestic, mundane noise that felt like a miracle of modern science. She had spent 40 years as a ghost in her own marriage, and now she was learning the weight of her own hands. This journey began at 2 a.m. with a phone call meant to pull me back into a burning building. But it ended with me realize that I was never the fire. I was the one who had been holding the extinguishers for people who kept striking matches. Looking back at the ruins of the Sarasota house and the silence of the last 5 years, I've distilled this decade of survival into 5 truths that I now carry as my only real inheritance. First, I learned that competence is not an invitation for neglect. For years, I believed that being strong meant I didn't deserve a seat at the table. I realized that my family used my resilience as a hall pass to ignore my needs. If you are the reliable one, remember that your strength is a gift to yourself, not a resource for people who refuse to grow up. Second, I discovered that loyalty to a lie is a slow suicide. My parents and Chloe were obsessed with the Thatcher legacy, a polished image that required the constant sacrifice of my truth and my money. When you protect someone's reputation at the expense of your reality, you aren't being loyal. You are being an accomplice to your own erasure. Third, the most important lesson was that family is a choice, not a DNA contract. Mr. Harrison saw me when my father didn't. Mark loved me when my sister used me. My grandmother protected me when my mother couldn't. These are the people who make a family. Blood gives people your coordinates, but only respect gives them a place in your life. Fourth, I realized that forgiveness without accountability is just permission to be hurt again. My parents didn't want my forgiveness. They wanted my signature. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a shield. True healing only began when I stopped providing the coverage for their choices. Finally, I learned that your worth is determined by what you build when no one is watching. Behind that water heater in the garage, my trophy was covered in dust, but the skills I used to win it were the very things that saved my life. Your potential doesn't vanish just because your family refuses to see it. The sound of the ocean is the only thing I have to answer to now. I am no longer a backup daughter or a financial safety net. I am a woman who set her own table and realized she only needed 3 chairs. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like a ghost in your own home, or the reliable one who was left behind, thank you for staying with me until the very end. Your support means everything to this community. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more deep dives into the complexities of the human heart and the power of walking away. Drop a comment below with the word keys if you're ready to unlock your own door. Until next time, remember, you are the architect of your own truth. Choose yourself.